Okay. And now I'm going to officially welcome you. I'm especially glad that it's working out, that Marilyn's able to be on here.
I don't know if she could hear us or see us.
I'm pretty sure she can hear us. Can you hear us, Marilyn?
I think she's muted, so I don't know if she knows how to unmute. So.
Well, okay. Well, let's go ahead. And Marilyn, if you want to say something to me, just click on your chat box. I'm going to begin. Welcome to topic 4, which is interpersonal relationships. I thought there was a really nice example of an interpersonal relationship. Francis, when we get to the part about Naomi and Ruth, think about what you just said about whatever gets downloaded on your computer will be downloaded on mine, because I see the similarity here. And I thought that was really nice. Anyway, it's a very interesting topic, and you'll find out that it contains many texts relating to various kinds of relationships, both family and friends. And there's a lot of text here, so it might be challenging to thoroughly discuss all of the relationships highlighted in this session. Also, depending on your group, not all of the participants are going to be involved in raising children or in the act of caring for parents. So it's important to be sensitive to all of these issues and potentially select only the 1 or 2 of the texts or 1 or 2 of the relationships to explore as a group, depending on, your group. So I always start with my agenda. We have an inspirational Facebook group where we post questions or supplemental materials, and I always like to invite everyone to join it. I'll send out the link with a follow-up email from our webinar. And I'm going to start with the themes, and there'll be questions. First of all, if you have any questions or any answers to things I'm asking, just jump in. I'm always happy. That's part of the whole reason to have this webinar. But I'm also going to go over the themes and the different texts and hopefully give you some insights which will help you to think about the topic. So one of the things I want to say is when exploring texts about parents and children, think about whether your participants are, like me, part of the sandwich generation, which is middle-aged adults who are caught between taking care of their children and taking care of their parents. Almost half, 47% of adults in their 40s and 50s, I'm actually not, I'm actually in my 60s, but I still have my parents, fit this profile according to the Pew Research Center, which is a nonprofit think tank in Washington, D.C. So that's a unique kind of challenge that some of your participants may be having, or some of you may be having. My children don't need as much care as my parents at this point. Anyway, let's start with the first text, when all you've ever wanted isn't enough. So before you read this text with your group or yourselves, think about the title that Rabbi Harold Kushner's book is called, When All You've Ever Wanted Isn't Enough. And a good way to start out is give the participants sheets of paper and have them write 3 things that they might consider all you've ever wanted. How would they characterize these items? Are they physical objects? Are they achievements? Are they relationships? And then read the text and discuss it and talk about what the message is. How is this story played out in their lives or your life? And I'm going to read the text so that we can think about it. I love this story. Here it goes. I was sitting on a beach one summer day watching 2 children, a boy and a girl, playing in the sand. They were hard at work building an elaborate sand castle by the water's edge, with gates and towers and moats and internal passages. Just when they had nearly finished their project, a big wave came along and knocked it down, reducing it to a heap of wet sand. I expected the children to burst into tears, devastated by what had happened to all their hard work. But they surprised me. Instead, they ran up the shore, away from the water, laughing and holding hands, and sat down to build another castle. I realized that they had taught me an important lesson. All the things in our lives, all the complicated structures we spend so much time and energy creating, are built on sand. Only our relationships to other people endure. Sooner or later, the wave will come along and knock down what we have worked so hard to build up. When that happens, only the person who has somebody's hand to hold will be able to laugh. So, a discussion is, what is the message of this? Anybody feel free to jump in. All right, well, then I will jump in myself. It's a message, first of all, obviously, that relationships are more important than things. But in addition to that, it's about your self-worth. If your self-worth is based on achievement and the wave knocks you down, then the person whose hand you hold has nothing to hold. So that's the idea, is to show that relationships are more important than achievement, and they're more important than objects. And when you go back and look at the list of things that you or your participants might have felt all they ever wanted, they can look back at what they've thought and see whether this is something that if they've seen things the same way. Does anybody want to jump in here and say anything at all about the story?
Well, I find that all I've ever wanted is different now than it was when I was younger, let's say. The all I've ever wanted now do indeed have to do with relationships rather than things. Mm-hmm. So, and unfortunately, I don't have all I've ever wanted, but it doesn't mean I don't still want it.
It's very interesting that you say that, because right now in Chai Mitzvah, we're working on a new curriculum for next year based on the 10 Commandments. And we are studying with the rabbi who's writing it. And yesterday we were talking about do not covet. And we were talking about how that doesn't necessarily mean things. It can mean, and not necessarily things that your friends or acquaintances have, maybe things that you've wanted for yourself and are not sure how to go about it. So what you say, I think, very much relates to what we talked about yesterday, and I think is also some of the wisdom that comes with life. You
can say age, it's okay.
Look, I'm not young either, so no, it's fine. But I think that you can increase in years and not increase in wisdom.
Absolutely, but it's interesting what you're saying about coveting, because I do indeed covet what some of my friends have, which is exactly what I wish I had. And I find there are times don't tell me that. It makes me, I wish I had that so badly. So.
Right. It's a very complicated issue, but it's interesting to think of when we're talking even about relationships here. So I'm sure we could go into it more deeply, but for now, it's just something to think about. And I'm glad you brought it up also, though, because it is very important. Anyway, we're going to push on, although we're going to keep this in the back of our minds as we go through our topics. So we're going to start with the text about parents and children's obligations to their parents. So before we read what it says on the screen, I'll read you the actual biblical text, which is, honor your father and your mother in order that your days may be prolonged on the soil that the eternal your God is giving you. That's from Exodus. And then each person, his mother and father, you are to hold in awe, and my Sabbaths you are to keep. I am the eternal your God. So that's from Leviticus. Keep this in mind, how they're different. We're going to come back to it in a little while. But the word yareh, Yud Resh Aleph, has been translated to mean revere. Everett Fox uses the term to hold in awe in this situation, which captures some of the subtleties of the Hebrew in the English. It's a translation which used to translate both the biblical and the rabbinic passages containing the Leviticus word. So let's look at the biblical commandment. It forms the basis of the relationship between children and parents. And I guess what I want to point out, and we'll get to it later as well, is it says to revere or to hold in awe and to honor. It doesn't say anything about love. So just keep this in the back of your mind. Rabbi Nevins quotes Rabbi Joseph Soloveitchik to note that Jewish law does not attempt to regulate the emotional side of the parent-child relationship. Awe is interpreted as the acknowledgement of parental authority, and honor is about requirements connected to ensuring physical comfort. So while love can and does often flow from the supportive environment of honor and awe, there seems to be an acknowledgement that emotions can't be dictated by law. Likewise, humans show devotion to God through fulfillment of the commandments with a hope that the act of engaging in mitzvot will lead to the awakening of a love for God. So that's something to keep in mind for the rabbinic understandings. Awe. Don't stand in the Father's place, nor contradict his words, nor side with his opponents in a dispute. And honor, provide the parents with food and drink, clothes and covering, and lead them in and out when they're old and need a helping hand. Okay, so how would you define honor or hold in awe?
Honor and I kind of equate with respect.
Uh-huh.
Although I'm the first one to say that nobody gets respect automatically, they have to earn it. I'm the first one to say that. But I think honor and respect are akin. Or that's almost, sometimes that's not too far from fear, I think.
That's an interesting way to look at it, and I like that. That's something I hadn't thought of, but I agree with you. And another thing here, so the later understandings, Scripture equates, hold on, David's making some noise. Okay, Scripture equates honoring parents with honoring God and cursing them with cursing God. So it's very interesting to put this, because later you'll see we are not to contradict our parents in public, but if they break a commandment, we should not follow them. We should do the right thing. So that's an interesting thing to look into. And if we move on to the parents' obligation to children, you'll see how that plays out also. In his article in The Observant Life, Rabbi Danny Nevins explains that the first obligation of parents is to provide their children with a physical and material environment that will allow them to grow properly. Once parents move beyond feeding, sheltering, and clothing their children, they're obligated to guide their children to develop good character. So he goes on to say that the goal of Jewish parenting is to raise children to adulthood by teaching them to sanctify life and to serve as God's partners in perfecting the world. And that's where this comes in about not breaking a commandment, even if your parents do. He reminds the reader that children don't move towards this goal on a single path or in a straight line. Instead, parents need to help each individual child discover their own unique interests and to develop the skills that will allow them to contribute most richly to the world around them. So I'm going to read the biblical text on the slide. And later on, we're also going to see in the supplemental materials, have any of you heard of the book, Blessing of a Skinned Knee? All right, keep this in mind it's very interesting and it relates to this. But anyway, so the biblical understanding, train a child in the way he ought to go. He will not swerve from it even in old age. So the biblical passage points out how important the household is in the development of the children. There's a quote attributed to Aristotle, and sometimes it's also thought of as a Jesuit motto: give me a child until he is 7, and I will give you the man. It's also been observed that troubled children very often come from troubled homes. So this biblical text is still very relevant today. And now if we go on and we go further in history, closer to us, rabbinic understandings, the parents are bound to welcome the child into the Jewish people, teach him or her the Torah, help him or her find a spouse, and teach him or her a livelihood. And some say teach him or her to swim, and that's because his life may depend on it. So the Talmud source reflects the fact that traditionally the commandments for child rearing were seen as the obligations of the father to the son, but in modern times, of course, the obligations outlined in our traditional sources are seen as the responsibility of both parents to both genders of children. And we're going to go into this a little more in detail later, but first I want to go to later understandings. And that is, if you truly wish your children to study Torah, study it yourself in their presence. They will follow your example. Otherwise, they will not themselves study Torah, but will simply instruct their children to do so. Okay? So obviously, we can't ask our children to do things that we don't do ourselves. We're examples to them, and they'll do what they see us do, not what we tell them to do. I'm sure everyone can think of an example of this. I'm trying to think of one from my own life. But I'll first tell you, you know the Harry Chapin song, Cats in the Cradle? In the beginning, right? Each time the son asks his father to join him in an activity, the son accepts his father's excuses and says he wants to be just like you, Dad. And in the end, right? He tells his father he'll visit him if he can find the time. So the final two lines of the song reflect the father's realization of what happened. My boy is just like me.
Uh-huh.
And I think that's probably true. I've found that my children have grown up they say they're turning into me. They're not really turning into me, I think. But there are certainly similarities, things that they find important that are the same as me, things that I hoped they would get but didn't quite get because they weren't that important to me, even though, I sent them all to day school. But I think it was partially because I was just too lazy to bring them to Hebrew school. And I think they're that's come through. But as a Jewish educator, one of my kids is going that direction. So, it's interesting to see. And I don't know if any of you are grandparents, but it's fun to watch your children become parents and watch how it reflects what you've done or haven't done.
I've always been taken with Heschel's comment about the commandment, the mitzvot, to honor one's parents. He commented that, of course, these were instructions given to adults, not to children. So if it's an instruction that's given to an adult, what could it possibly mean? And he concludes that what it means is the commandment is telling an adult to live the kind of life that their children could not help but honor.
That's really nice. I am going to put that in our follow-up email. I really like that. Thank you for sharing it. It's very, very true. Yeah, and that goes on to the next. Okay, here are some really specific obligations to children, and you were the perfect segue. How do we continue these practices in modern times? So how do we perpetuate the legacy intended by each obligation? So let's look at the different obligations, and there's like a little explanation of them to make them easier to understand. So circumcise, that means entering the covenant. And whether it's a brit milah, a circumcision ceremony for a boy, or a naming for a girl, the obligation to formally bring the child into the covenant signifies that the infant is part of a greater whole and purpose, including contributing to the Jewish people. I think nowadays there are a lot of mixed marriages. I know even when I taught, and different denominations welcome different Jewish, I taught in a place where if one parent was Jewish, fine, you're in. But, in some places not so. So that's something for us to think about in modern times. If anyone has something. Yes, David.
Well, in modern times, if there's a concern about Judaism being more egalitarian,
Mm-hmm.
what do we make out of the fact that the men are brought into the covenant by what is, in fair terms, from one perspective, clear bodily mutilation, but women are not?
Well, actually, nowadays, there's something called a brit shalom, and it does not involve circumcision. I know Reconstructionist rabbis do it. There's if you go online, there's a whole, in fact, I'll also add that to our follow-up email. But a brit shalom, they do the same blessings that they do. They talk about all the things that you would normally talk about at a bris, what the name comes from, et cetera, et cetera. They do everything but the snip. So that is, that's an accepted practice among people who accept it nowadays. So I think it's kind of up to the parents, because the baby obviously at that point can't make a decision. But
no, but the question is, is there a teaching?
Well, that's
I've talked to a number of people who regard themselves as living a kind of Torah life,
Mm-hmm.
and they're insistent that the commandment to be fruitful and multiplies is a commandment only given to men, not to women, which is why Orthodoxy has always permitted birth control.
Interesting. So I wonder if that was a way for Orthodoxy to get around something that they knew had to happen anyway. I'm just muting you for a second, but please unmute yourself when you want to speak. I'm only doing it because there's a crinkling noise. But anyway, I think that kind of leads us to, it kind of is denominational. And the thing about Judaism is, and I think why we continue to evolve and to be able to be a living religion, is that there's a whole spectrum. And certainly, I'm sure that my Orthodox relatives in Israel would not consider a Brit Shalom something that they would support. But my daughter in California certainly sees that as completely valid. So it depends on who you are and what you believe. But I would like to think that the Jewish religion on some level will accept a spectrum of people. And yeah, well, we can't tell anybody what to think, but neither can they tell us what to accept, and we can still be Jewish. That's how I would like to see it. I don't know whether you agree or not.
How Talmudic.
Yeah, it is kind of Talmudic, right? Because just because they interpreted the laws then doesn't mean we can't continue to interpret them.
Well, what we turned the Talmud into is something different than what people were doing when they were doing it.
Exactly.
They were into the disagreement.
Exactly.
We now to rigidify it and calcify it, and which is different than what it was.
When we talk about chavruta and being friends, one of the things is when you're studying to challenge. That's considered a good friend. That's right on topic. And it definitely, when we get past our parents and children and we get to that, I think you'll see that what we're doing is like one of the most valid ways to keep the tradition alive, in my opinion, anyway. But going back to redeem, concretize historical conscience. So the Pidyon Haben, redeeming the firstborn, again, it's for the mother's firstborn male child. So we can certainly go down David's line of thinking here. It serves as a remembrance of the Exodus from Egypt and the 10th plague. I think that in modern times, I think there are a lot of ways to connect our children to history. And I think that's what this kind of tells us to do, is to connect them to our history in one way or another. Teach Torah, transmitting Judaism. Parents are obligated to concern themselves with the intellectual and spiritual growth of the Jewish people and passing on this inheritance to their children. So in modern times, we still need to send them to school or to teach them. It might be a little bit different than it was in ancient times, but I think the tradition is the same. Again, David, if you want to unmute yourself, just go ahead. There's just like a crinkling noise, so just when you want to speak. Take a wife, spouse, partner. Companionship or propagation. Judaism asserts that human beings need other human beings in their lives and advocates for a life of community rather than seclusion. On the other hand, Judaism also teaches the importance of contributing to the growth of the Jewish people. This can be interpreted literally as bringing children into the world or raising children in our homes, as well as more broadly as contributing in other ways to the growth of the community. So again, in modern times, you don't necessarily have to have 10 children, but contribute to the community is the same part of this commandment. Teaching a craft, independence. So there's a commitment to our practical lives and the need to lead productive, contributing, self-sustaining lives. Judaism embraces the realities of the world and values the ability for each individual to sustain his or herself. That's like teaching your child to swim, teaching them some way. Teach to swim, protection. Another important value in Judaism is pikuach hanefesh, literally saving a soul, but often understood as saving a life. This commandment begins with giving our children the life skills they will need in order to keep themselves from harm's way and the threats of the world that may emerge as children assert greater independence. And I think that's pretty much self-explanatory, but if anyone has a question, I'm happy to think about it. Okay, so let's turn our thoughts now to friendship, to Ruth and Naomi. And to Frances, who was such a good friend to Marilyn.
Oh, I hope is part of this.
I see her picture here, and I see her. She's not muted. Marilyn, are you there? Oh, David just disappeared. Okay. Anyway, Adele Reinhardt, in the introduction to the book of Ruth in the Jewish Study Bible, points out that the story of Ruth is a story of the move from emptiness to fulfillment. The themes expressed in two spheres, the agricultural and the personal, as the characters move from a place of famine and loss to a land of bounty, marriage, and the birth of a child who is ultimately related to King David. The love and loyalty expressed through the relationship between Ruth and Naomi is the most positive biblical portrayal of women's relationships. So here are the very famous words that Ruth says to Naomi when Naomi urges her to return to her people and her gods. She says, "Do not urge me to leave you, to turn back and not follow you. For wherever you go, I will go. Wherever you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God my God. From where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. Thus and more may the Eternal do to me, if anything but death parts me from you." So, based on this pledge, I hear a feedback. I'm going to, okay. So, based on this pledge, the rest of the story of Ruth.
You're muted now. Can't hear you, Nina. You're muted. There you go.
I heard
That's
it.
better.
Sorry. Okay, if we hear feedback, we'll deal with it.
Oh, Marilyn's muted now.
Yes, because I heard a feedback and I didn't know why I heard it. I thought it might be Marilyn. All right. So, so let's think about it. What are the foundations for friendship? I'm going to mute you for a second, Francis, but unmute yourself whenever you want to speak because I hear a feedback. Let's see. Do I now hear the feedback? No, I don't hear it anymore. So just unmute yourself when you want to speak. So Ruth's story is touching and it's noble. It talks about chesed, which is fidelity, loyalty, reliability, stability, trustworthiness. Ruth binds herself to Naomi and binds herself to a people, and through acts of kindness as well as courage, she's an example of decency and vision. So, so Ruth specifies lodging people and God as the basis of their relationship. How do these elements enhance a friendship, and what elements do you think can serve as a foundation for friendship? I'm now unmuting you, Francis. Okay.
Lodging people and God, for me, I don't think are the basic fundamentals of a friendship. I think they can enhance a friendship, but as a foundation for friendship, I think there has to be an emotional or a spiritual or some kind of connection first. And there just has to be some kind of connection. Otherwise, you meet so many people in the course of a day and you just go by them and you carry on. But then you meet someone. It's like when you meet someone and you fall in love. There's a connection. There's a chemistry of some kind. So what elements? For me, the basis is some kind of connection, an empathy, I think. I think empathy is the biggest thing for me.
I agree with you. I think it's interesting because Ruth and Naomi already had a relationship when Ruth said these things to Naomi. And you're right. But they also reflect empathy. And I think you're right. I think empathy is probably the most important element of a friendship. I agree with you on that. How about you, Marilyn? Are you able to speak? I'm going to maybe send her a chat in case. Okay. Okay. So
I can call her again and see.
No, I'm going to do this. Marilyn.
I think it was just a little too fast for her to,
Yeah. If you have a comment, please chat. Okay. So if she gets it.
Oh yeah, that's showing up here. I see it. Yeah.
Right. So maybe Marilyn will see it as well. I hope. But anyway, I felt when you said that thing to her about, whatever shows up on your computer will show up on mine. To me, that was a perfect example of what Ruth would have said to Naomi were they on a webinar. So I like that a lot. Now we have an example of male friendship, David and Jonathan. And this is a very interesting example. In the Jewish Study Bible, Shimon Bar Ephrat notes that in his introduction to the book of Samuel, that the first book of Samuel consists of narratives whose central concern is with the personal lives of the leaders portrayed in the text. So their dreams, their feelings, their desires are depicted realistically, describing both the negative and positive qualities of the leaders. I always loved David because he was not perfect. but he was wonderful. And I admire that he is, you know, in our tradition, the Mashiach will descend from David. But David certainly made some mistakes, and I think it's wonderful that I just love him as an example. He's one of my favorite. And so the text we study in this session follows David's slaying of the giant Goliath. And King Saul, who's the king at the time, asks his military general to summon the boy who killed the Philistine. And this narrative picks up right after David identifies himself to King Saul as the son of Jesse the Bethlehemite. Here we have the beginning of the story of one of the great friendships recorded in the Bible, the friendship of Jonathan, who's King Saul's son, and David, who's going to be the future king of Israel. It's important to notice that throughout the book, Saul is depicted as an unstable character who's ultimately not suited to be the king of Israel. On the other hand, David is portrayed in a very positive light with many talents and great strengths. He's depicted as a respectful and loyal to Saul, even when he sins. We see him engaging in full repentance. That's one of the reasons I like him. So here's the text. Saul urged his son Jonathan and all his courtiers to kill David. But Saul's son Jonathan was very fond of David. And Jonathan told David, "My father Saul is bent on killing you. Be on your guard tomorrow morning. Get to a secret place and remain in hiding. I will go out and stand next to my father in the field where you will be, and I will speak to my father about you. If I learn anything, I'll tell you." So Jonathan spoke well of David to his father Saul. He said to him, "Let not your majesty wrong his servant David, for he has not wronged you. Indeed, all his actions have been very much to your advantage." Saul heeded Jonathan's plea, and Saul swore, "As the Eternal lives, he shall not be put to death." Jonathan called David, and Jonathan told him all this. Then Jonathan brought David to Saul, and he served him as before. So one of the things is the reason Saul wanted to kill David was he was jealous of him. But this is a nice turn of events. And what I'd like to ask you is, do you think Jonathan's behavior was right according to what we studied about children and their parents? I'm going to unmute you because you are muted. Here.
I'm thinking.
So
I because it does say, we were saying in the commandments, if your parents do something that's wrong, you don't follow them. Doesn't mean you have to go on that path. And Jonathan chose not to.
Exactly. And I think it can lead to a very interesting discussion about what is breaking a commandment? When do you break off from that? We have a teen curriculum, and that's one of the big questions. When do you side with your family? And when do you side with your friends? When is it appropriate? And it's a big question for adults and anyone, really. All right. So let's go on and talk about rabbinic understandings of friendship. So the first quote you see on the screen is very famous, probably because it's both straightforward and it's very good advice. As you know, it's much easier to succeed when you have a support system. And this is a very, very famous quote. Joshua ben Pariah says, "Set up a master, a Rav, for yourself, and acquire for yourself a friend, a companion, a disciple, a chaver, and give everybody the benefit of doubt." So, and then there's a long quote that comes after this. I only put part of it on the screen, but it relates to this Pirkei Avot quote. And that is, "And acquire for yourself a friend or companion." How so? This teaches that a person should acquire for him or herself a friend or companion, a person with whom to eat, with whom to drink, with whom to study scripture, with whom to study Mishnah, with whom to sleep in the same house, and with whom to reveal all of the person's secrets, the secrets of Torah, in other words, the methods and principles of logical deduction and reasoning, and the secrets of Derech Eretz, the way the world works, common decency. That when the two sit studying Torah and one of them makes a mistake in a matter of law, or a chapter heading, or says of the forbidden that it is permitted, or of the permitted that it's forbidden, the friend or companion will correct the other. So in other words, if you make a mistake, your friend will actually correct you. And where do we hear that when the companion corrects the other and studies together, that they are well rewarded for their labor? It is said in Ecclesiastes, 2 are better than 1, because they have a good reward for their labor. So this is an interesting definition of what it means to have and to be a friend. And I'm curious whether you think it describes your friendships or friendships that modern friendships. And if so, why or why not? Oh, you are muted, Francis. Here. Yes. I thought I unmuted you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I find I have different friends in different places that play different roles in my life. I have a friend who is a very, very dear friend. For the longest time, if I wanted an opinion, I would ask her. And she is the best fence sitter in the world. She never comes down one side or the other. She is absolutely an expert at it. And I used to get so frustrated, I would try and force her into giving me an opinion. And it never worked. And I finally learned that isn't the role she plays for me. I have other friends who won't hesitate if they think I'm being stupid or ridiculous or whatever. They have no compunctions about telling me. So they have their places. So I find I have different friends for different needs at different times. And they often do not overlap.
It's interesting that you said that, because that has been a recurring thing that's happened every time I've taught this particular topic. So I think that must be something that's true of just about everyone. Also, I have friends that will definitely contradict me, but certain ones do it in a way that's great. Like they'll ask a question and bring it out so that I'll kind of learn. And those are the people that I really enjoy getting advice from. So that's an interesting point. The two elements that really stood out to me were that a friend corrects a friend and that they share secrets. Both involve a special kind of trust. And it's interesting to keep this in mind as we go to the next two texts. So Rabbi Eliezer says, let the respect owing to your companion be as precious to you as the respect owing to yourself. And Rabbi Yossi says, let your fellow's money be as precious to you as your own. That's from Pirkei Avot. And the key word here, I think, is respect. The rabbis are saying that respect builds trust. This reminds me of the story of David and Jonathan. We're told that Jonathan loved David as he loved himself. And that's the same value at work as the last Pirkei Avot text. Let your fellow's money be as precious to you as your own. In other words, let everything of your friend be as precious to you as your own things. You know, love your friend as you love yourself and give them the same respect that you would want to have. So these are...
Sorry.
Yeah. No, go ahead.
It's interesting because I often find we are far kinder to our friends than we are to ourselves when it comes to cutting slack, or if you're having a really stressful time. I have said to friends, you know, now if one of your friends had just told you what you told me, what would you tell them to do? And, you know, well, take it easy and think it over. And then I said, well, there you go. If we were just as kind to ourselves as we are to our friends, I think it would, a lot of things would be very different.
I think that's very true. I remember I was talking about this in our thing yesterday also, that there are certain standards we have for ourselves towards our friends, and some people share them and some people don't. And if we all shared them, there would be so much less strife.
Oh, for sure.
Right. So that's an interesting thought. I want to go to modern understandings of friendship because this relates as well. So in addition to the conversations, there are two questions. Oh, I just did this. Okay. Yeah. There are two questions that might help bring the topic home. This is written by Rabbi Lori Foreman, and her definition of friendship, we can look at it and see if it's similar or different from the friendships described in the Bible and the rabbinical texts and our own definitions of friendship. So here we go. I love this. She wrote this in 2001. During our lifetime, we acquire many kinds of friends, as Francis was saying. In each of them, we may encounter a bit of the divine. They are angels sent by God with a particular mission, sent by the Holy One of blessing to teach us something. We have friends that we know from childhood and other friends from college. We have friends from the community, and other involvement and from friends from work. Yet the one true find is a friend who loves us unconditionally. This is the person who goes out of his or her way to be there for us. This is a friend whom we call upon in moments of crisis and know that he or she will drop everything and come running. This is a friend who always makes time to listen to our concerns, our dreams, and even our complaints.
That's so true.
It's so true. I've found in my work that that kind of a friend, unfortunately, seems more of the past than of the present. I don't think my millennial kids even expect that of someone.
No, I agree with you.
And I don't know why that is, but it seems to be true. Even if they're spouses, I'm not sure that they accept that. And they're very happy and everything's fine. But I know that in my time, your friend called you, and if you were a real friend, you were there. And I find that in my community, we can very much find that, you know, and I actually live on a boat, and my friends are all other sailors on boats. We live in the marina, and you can be sure that whatever you need, someone will be there, and they'll do what you need. Maybe not as true in the suburbs. Maybe it has to do with how hard life is, you know, how my 3-year-old grandson is already applying to school for next year. Maybe their lives are just really tough. But I think that this is an important aspect of friendship that we need to cultivate and to keep in mind. And it certainly is in Jewish tradition, that's what a friend should be, I think. It'd be important to discuss this with our groups as well. Okay, well, if there are no other comments, I'm going to go with personal reflections. So each source book has questions on the back cover to help focus us on the independent projects. At the end of the session, it's good to take a couple of minutes, look at the questions on the back cover, and have each participant answer them, either in writing or and share as a group, whichever works best for you. So the 2 questions that go with the topic of friendship are, how have your friends influenced the choices you've made for your independent projects? And how have your independent projects impacted on your relationships with friends? So I don't know if you've started your independent projects yet or what you're doing.
I'm not sure what that is.
Oh, okay. So we have Chai Mitzvah, in addition to studying, we like people to do some kind of social action, to pick something.
Right.
And that's what this is about. And also some kind of ritual that you want to take on or deepen. It could be.
Oh, okay. This was in the profile thing.
Yeah. Yes, exactly.
Okay.
Have you chosen what you want to do yet?
Well, yes and no. I had my only sister died not too long ago, a few weeks ago.
I'm sorry.
Thank you. And
My sister also.
I'm having trouble focusing on what I want to do because I'm finding that my faith is wavering. I have to get back on track. So yes and no to answer your question. I'm in shul every Friday night. Whether that counts as a ritual or not, or you have to pick a new one, I don't know.
No, I think that actually it would make a lot of sense if your independent project was related to this, because it's very meaningful to you. It's like something that's really there. I also lost my sister. I understand. It was many years ago, though. But it is really something that I think would be great to focus on in terms of how it could help you work it through and help you to find meaning and to be involved in the community. Like I think it has all the aspects of something meaningful. So maybe
I think so too. I sort of put it down on the sheet, but I think I have to reword it because I'm pretty angry at God right now too, and I'm angry at her too. I yell at her quite frequently. You know, how could she do that? How could she die and leave me? The nerve, you know. Yeah,
it's tough. It's very tough.
So that kind of stuff. I'm sort of working through that. You know, we're just starting the first. I just had a family Hanukkah party, the first of the first. It was a bittersweet thing, you know.
Yeah.
So, so I know what you mean. Do I have something not specifically identified yet? It hasn't crystallized, I guess.
I think you have to let it percolate and it will crystallize.
I think you're right. But my friends, oh my gosh, you know, you get by with, absolutely. There is no question. do my friends influence my choices? They used to a lot more. I was very much a people pleaser. I was a wonderful codependent. I was so good at it. Oh, come, I'll fix you. It took a lot of hard work to get over that. So at this late stage of the game, I'm sort of still emerging as a person that has enough confidence in my own decisions that I don't need somebody else to make them for me or to approve of them, I guess.
I completely understand you. And I think that's wonderful. And I think you should be very proud of yourself.
Thank you.
Yeah. All right, let's look at our supplemental materials because these are really good. The first one is Secrets to a Happy Life from a Harvard study. It was in the New York Times. This Harvard study reveals that a strong social network is the best predictor for lifespan and happiness, more than money or fame. Parent is a verb, our adult children. This woman, Anita Silver, used to work for Chai Mitzvah, and she addresses the topic of how we create relationships with our children to sustain them long after we've meaningful control over the details of their lives. She's also very funny. I would really recommend this to you. The next one is excerpt from The Blessing of a Skinned Knee, Discovering Your Unique and Ordinary Child. This is the book I was referring to before. What it basically says is the sages advise us to study Torah Lishma, Torah for its own sake, and rather to impress others with our scholarship. And this is the same thing we should do with our children. A paradox of parenting is that if we love our children for their own sake, rather than for their achievements, it's more likely that they'll reach their true potential. This is a very complicated issue, but I think it's a very interesting thing to read. The next one, Teen Friendships in the Digital Age from the Pew Research Center. So from measuring teens' internet usage to finding out what devices they own, Pew Research Center has been examining the digital lives of teenagers for over a decade. As you can imagine, this changes all the time. The latest report focuses on how teens, who often lead tech-saturated lives, develop and sustain friendships in the digital age, including where they meet, communicate, and spend time with friends. That could be interesting. And then the last of our supplemental materials, 6 lessons for the sandwich generation, how to manage your parents, your kids, and your sanity. And this is nice because Charles Passy, he's a member of the sandwich generation. He's got his children on one hand and his parents on the other. But he's come to realize that his daily burden is also a reminder how blessed he truly is to have all these people in his life. So that's a nice one as well. I'm going to send this with my follow-up email as well so that you can click on them and you can read them and see what you think. So this is the time of the webinar where we do any Q&A if you have.
No, well, for me, I think we've covered them as we've gone through it.
I think so too. And I appreciate your both you and David's communicating and taking part. And Marilyn, I hope that that you were actually able to type if necessary. And
she'll know for the next one. I think it was just a little too fast trying to get it all set up. So
yes, well,
anyway.
hopefully she will be here on the next one. And I thank all of you for participating.
Well, thank you. It was very interesting. Thank you.
It was very interesting. Thanks for your insights.
Okay, so take good care.
You too. And
I guess we will be in touch.
We certainly will.
Okay.
Okay.
Thanks, Stephen.
Okay. Bye.
Bye-bye.